What's going on, everybody? Brian here to give you a quick little review of Telltale Games, the Game of Thrones, Episode 2, The Lost Lords. I'll have to admit, after the credits rolled on the first episode of the Game of Thrones series, I wasn't really convinced that they could put together a story that would have our heroes, the Foresters, in any kind of possible advantage. But this one around, I found myself a bit more involved and a little bit relieved. My initial thoughts on the first episode, if you didn't read it on highschoolreviews.com, were that it just existed for fan service of the actual HBO series, and it's probably still the case, but at least this time there's well, let me take that back. It just seems like certain plot elements seemed a little too convenient to stick these new characters into, only to have ways of showing us the characters that we love from the show, or hate for that matter. And there's nothing wrong with that, but the first episode just seemed like very excessive with it. Fortunately, the existing characters from the show seem to take a back seat a bit, as the writers are kind of letting these new characters have their time to shine, which is a good thing. Some of the issues I had with the first episode that actually still exist with the second, one of which is the use of the watercolor-like backgrounds in the episodes. And it was still distracting a little bit, and I started not to really care about it that much, but the background art started to bleed into the character models that gave the characters, parts of their bodies with like kind of a watercolor element. Now, I don't know if that was on purpose, but it just made it more distracting for me. And if it weren't for that, I probably wouldn't have said anything about it. But seeing those blemishes just made me want to bring it back up again. Another issue was the constant stuttering of the picture and the audio. Now, some would argue like, well, that's just Telltale Game, that's just what happens. But I'm having a hard time finding that as an excuse anymore, especially on newer platforms. There was more than 2 or 3 occasions where I found the scenes were skipping and the audio repeating, which that shouldn't be tolerable for anybody anymore. And as much as I like the game, there's these little hiccups in these Telltale games that shouldn't be around just because it has a reputation, and it's something that the developers, I think, just really need to fix. Aside from the technical aspects of it, I found myself enjoying it. This episode is a lot more than the first. It seemed that the story broke out it did break out into other areas of Westeros and Essos to give it a little bit more variety. Now, and while I'm glad to have gotten the first episode a month ago, I found it very tedious because it seemed like they were in locations for a very, very long time. And it seems like they were just doing things for the sake of taking up time, as opposed to, keeping the story elements, fleshing out the story a little bit. Episode 2 it seems like the writers got the pacing a little bit more right this time around, and with the more locations, the scenes kind of, cut to other scenes faster, so it kept my interest up a little bit more. And when I went back to those scenes or those locations later, I didn't mind because I knew I wasn't going to be there for, an extended amount of time. Another aspect that I like was that I felt that the decisions I made on the decision wheel actually do have an impact in the game this time around, especially when you get to the wall and then you meet 2 new characters, and when you're at King's Landing. Now, I should say that I did not play this game a second time through to find out, and it's not that I'm not curious about it, it's just I believe that in these type of games that you just have to stick to your original decisions in your playthrough, whether they were good or bad. And while The Lost Lords, the second episode, is a vast improvement over the first episode, I believe that we have not seen the best of what the writers and developers have to offer with this series. It's about time we start getting to the action a little bit more, as these 2 episodes, once again, I do think the second episode is better than the first, but they play with a lot of the politics of the story, which is, Game of Thrones. That's part of the, why people like it, is the politics between the houses and whatnot, and the wheelings and dealings and the gardens and King's Landing and so on. But we also come to see how it plays out, and it's getting about that time for the Foresters, our heroes, essentially in this series, to stop playing the victims. Overall, Lost Lords was a much better outing than the first. Bringing it new locations and characters helped with keeping an interest in the story this time around, and the choice system seemed like it was actually had an effect on your story. However, the technical problems of the first one seemed to be even worse this time around, which is unfortunate, and there's just some things that shouldn't be overlooked anymore, as the developers shouldn't really have an excuse anymore for this to keep on going. But having said that, I do give Game of Thrones Episode 2 a 4 out of 5. For more reviews and articles, come to highscorereviews.com. My name is Brian, and I am out.